Thank you, everyone, for joining me for these live internet studies. My name is Ariel, ben-Lyman, HaNaviy. The studies are an hour and a half long. There's two basic studies back to back. First study is Eschatology, a biblical study of end-time events, where we talk about end-time prophecy, Rapture, Antichrist, Book of Daniel, Mystery Babylon, Book of Revelation, things like that. So stick around. We're going to jump into that momentarily. The second study, the second segment of the hour and a half long study is entitled A Trinitarian Response to Biblical Unitarianism, and it's an apologetic study where we pit Trinitarian views versus non-Trinitarian views on certain Bible passages. So stick around for that as well if that's a topic you're interested in. All right, let's jump right into topic number one. Take a look at your screen right now. If you're watching the YouTube video, this is the list of the 18 so far topics that we've been going through. The yellow one highlighted, topic 12, is where we're at right now. Rapture views, a final analysis. What we basically did is we're working from gotquestions.org's resource from a question that they posed about one of the four views of the historic premillennialism, which the four views that I'll talk about here in a moment: pre-tribulational rapture, mid-tribulational rapture, post-tribulation rapture, and pre-wrath rapture. Those are the four that I'm only highlighting. What we've been looking at is what are the strengths and weaknesses of the post-tribulational view of the rapture, otherwise known as post-tribulationism. And so we already worked our way down through that. What we're going to do now is turn to my own objections to post-tribulationism. So I am a pre-wrather, in case you didn't know. Pre-wrath position, which I'm only going to briefly define. I'm not going to jump into a deep dive of what the definition is. I'm waiting for that until we get to actually gotquestions.org is going to turn into strengths and weaknesses of the pre-wrath position. Once we finish this post-trib view, they're going to turn to pre-wrath, and at that point in time, I will just give you the longer definition of what pre-wrath is. Tonight, you're going to have to settle for the short definition. So, after we look at here's where we're going to go tonight. After we look at the four views, just briefly, what they entail, then we're going to turn to these objections. I don't imagine I'm going to get through it because it's a bit lengthy. We'll just have to take it step by step, and it'll probably take a few weeks, maybe 2 or 3. We'll see what happens. Okay, so real quick, let me jump over to the charts that I've been using. Get out my little marker tool here. What are the four positions that are in view in any given position? So looking at the upper left corner real quick, let me just draw. We've got the pre-tribulation rapture with a rapture at the very beginning of what they identify as the 7-year tribulation period. And by comparison there, what they call second coming is over at the very end of that 7-year period. Some notable features are God's wrath kind of runs the full length of this time period. It's broken up into 3.5 years of tribulation, 3.5 years of great tribulation. All right. The second view that we're going to be looking at is the mid-tribulation rapture, upper right corner there. They put their rapture basically in the middle of the 7-year time frame. There's still that division of tribulation on the first 3.5 years, great tribulation on the second 3.5 years, and like the pre-tribbers before them, they place a second coming at the far end of the 7 years. The notable difference is their God's wrath slice has been shrunk down to half the length of the pre-trib version. And so from their perspective, God's wrath only occupies the same time frame as what they call the Great Tribulation, i.e. the last 3.5 years. So, moving on. The post-trib rapture at the far lower left side of my screen has another 7-year time frame, but this time they take the second coming and the rapture and they place them synonymous with one another, downplaying the rapture and really kind of emphasizing the second coming. We're going to draw that out tonight as we talk about this particular position. Notably, however, in this version, which I believe is a classic version of post-trib, they label God's wrath as basically occupying all of the 7 years, if this chart is accurate. There are variations along these. All four of these positions have kind of classic versions and variated versions. But the classic version of this, I believe, is the chart you're looking at. So God's wrath occupies the entire 7-year length. But it is broken up into the 3.5, on the front half being tribulation, and the last 3.5 being great tribulation. All right. And then finally, we have this view known as Prewrath Rapture, which, let me give it a little bit of love. There we go. That's the version that I myself personally hold to, Prewrath Rapture. Suddenly, a bunch of radical things start taking place. I'm actually going to read the little script down here at the bottom. Prewrath Rapturists believe the rapture will occur following the opening of the 6th seal of the book of Revelation. The church will experience severe persecution by the Antichrist, right? That's the Great Tribulation, but will be snatched away, i.e. raptured, before God begins to pour out his wrath during what is known as the day of the Lord. So we have a rapture here. But then that kicks off the time period that's known as the second coming. So in this version, there's not really a separate second coming that's separated from the rapture. So it almost sounds similar to the post-tribbers, but it really isn't. Instead, the rapture initiates the period known as second coming. There's only one second coming, but the second coming culminates at the Battle of Armageddon near the very end of the week, actually about 30 days after the end of the 7-year time frame, which that 7-year time frame itself is no longer labeled the 7-year tribulation. Instead, in the pre-wrath rapture model, the 7-year time frame is broken down into 3 sections. First 3.5 years is called beginning of sorrows. Alternately, you can call this the beginning, the birth pangs, depending on which version of the Bible you're reading. Starting at the midpoint, we have a section known as the Great Tribulation that is anticipated to go through the entire 3.5 years of the second half, but it's going to be interrupted by the rapture, kicking off the time frame known as the Day of the Lord, which will kind of neutralize a lot of the activity of the Great Tribulation, at least from the Christian church point of view, but it will still allow Antichrist to somewhat have his way against national Israel. We'll talk about those details later on. But those are the 4 basic views that we're kind of working from. So let's start looking at my own objections to the post-trib view. All right. Let's see. Do I want to rehash and tell you what kind of post-tribbers believe? No, I guess I'll kind of hit it as we go along. So let's just kind of start into this particular study. My aim, by the way, is to lovingly, gently, but convincingly try to get those of you out there who are post-tribbers to just take the final step and come on over and become a pre-wrather. And what I mean by that is, you've already probably become dissatisfied with the pre-tribbers, and you've poked enough holes in their position to realize that it's not defensible as a position. Even though it retains some biblical truths, you realize that as a whole, as a position, it's indefensible. And so you jumped ship from pre-trib to post-trib, but I'm telling you didn't go far enough. Because what I aim to do is to convince you that the pre-wrath actually synthesizes all of the strengths of the previous 3 positions, the post-trib, the mid-trib, the pre-trib, the mid-trib, the post-trib. It synthesizes the strengths of those, it retains the strengths of them, and it rejects the weaknesses of them. At the same time, I realize it introduces its own set of weaknesses. It is true that no position is airtight. No position has airtight defenses. All of them have weaknesses, but to the degree that we're learning more and more about God's Word, and to the degree that we believe as Bible students that as we draw closer and closer to the time when Yeshua returns, that the Spirit is going to continue to reveal more to us, right? There's a sense of that going on as well, which I believe has a scriptural basis to it. as we draw closer and closer. Yeshua wants us to be prepared. He doesn't want us to be in the dark. He doesn't want us to be asleep. He's not telling us the day, the hour of his return, but he's certainly giving us, by his Spirit, more and more insight into what these passages about eschatology mean. So I believe that's the Spirit of God working within the body to help get us prepared. But to that degree, the pre-wrath position, since it's the Johnny-come-lately, has an advantage over the earlier positions because it has the benefit of looking at the three positions and kind of evaluating them so that it can come up with its synthetic view, is what I mean by that. All right, let's go down through these objections. In other words, why am I not just a post-tribber? If I've rejected pre-trib, if I've rejected mid-trib, why don't I just go with the post-trib if it seems like it's already answered all the questions for me? And historically, it is the position that retains what I believe the original church fathers kind of walked away with when they were reading the scriptures. They were like, hey, we're going to see the Antichrist. And of course, the pre-tribbers reject that, but the post-tribbers, I think, get it right. I mean, taking at face value, Yeshua said immediately after the tribulation of those days, right? Matthew 24, verse 29. So a rapture after the tribulation is what post-tribulationism teaches. So let's read down through it. All right. Prewrath Objections to Posttribulationism by Ariel, ben-Lyman, HaNaviy. Here are 5 random yet important reasons classic Prewrathers, such as myself. I'm using this word classic because I'm trying to recognize that some post-tribbers have adopted this term pre-wrath, and there's this kind of a hybrid version called post-trib pre-wrath now that Alan Kurschner just really he doesn't like that term. He's like, you can't be a post-trib and pre-wrath. They're two contradictory terms. He's talking about positionally. You can't be a post-tribber and a pre-wrather. But if we're just playing with the labels and not the positions themselves, right? Not positionally speaking, but just definition of labels, the pre-tribbers are also pre-wrath because they believe there's going to be a rapture prior to any wrath being poured out. So that would label them. That would categorize them or classify them. What's the word I'm looking for? Qualify. That's the word I'm looking for. That would qualify them as being pre-wrath. The mid-trib also does the same thing. So let me go back over to the slide that I was talking about, that I had up a moment ago. If you look at the slide that's called God's wrath in the upper left corner, pre-trib. Let's just blow it up so you can see what I'm talking about. If you look at where God's wrath is setting in this chart, pre-trib puts a rapture prior to the wrath. That means they qualify as pre-wrath. Let's play with the words some more. Mid-trib puts a rapture prior to God's wrath as well. That means they are also, I'm using air quotes with my fingers for those of you who can't see me, they're also pre-wrath, right? The post-tribbers do not, in their classic sense, do not have their rapture prior to wrath. So they are post-trib, post-wrath, in the classic sense of the word. And then the pre-wrath, of course, is really, truly pre-wrath. So in those 4 views, if we're playing with the terminology, when we look at the word tribulation, post-trib, we pre-wrathers also post-trib because we do believe that the rapture takes place after the Great Tribulation. It's only the pre-tribbers who are truly pre-trib, and the mid-tribbers who are also truly pre-Great Trib, but they're not pre-generic trib. So these terminologies, these terminologies that we use, they're going to either make or break the discussion sometimes. So do yourself a favor. When you're talking with another Bible student who holds to any particular rapture view, get them to define their terms before you guys go to blows. Because you might just be talking about the same thing, but just missing each other because of your differences in the terminology. So I like to highlight what I mean by my terminology up front. So classic pre-wrathers. What do you mean by classic? I mean classic in the sense of the fathers of pre-wrath, such as Marvin Rosenthal, and now his son David Rosenthal, because Marvin passed away. Papa Marv passed away, I think, in 2022 or 23, somewhere around there, just a few years ago. So David Rosenthal runs Zion's Hope, which is the ministry that Marv left behind him. And Marv is one of the original book authors of the Prewrath Rapture of the Church, followed a few years later in the 90s by, early 90s we're talking, 1990s, by Robert Van Kampen's The Sign. And Van Kampen and Van Kampen and Rosenthal are friends, so they collaborated with one another. Just one of them's books came out first and the other came out a few years later. But both of them are really truly the fathers of the Prewrath position. But since then, other well-gifted, informed, trained speakers have come along. Alan Kurschner is probably one of the more vocal spokespersons of the Prewrath position. So all of these guys are classic to me. This means that there's another view of people that call themselves kind of Prewrath that are more of the hybrid of Posttrib. They're called Posttrib Prewrath. You know what? I may as well show it to you because you guys don't know what I'm talking about. Posttrib Prewrath. Let's just open that. It's this version right here. The classic version is the one on the top where the day of the Lord is occupying the entire length of the 7 years, and it's followed by a rapture at the far end that is that coincides with the Battle of Armageddon. That's your classic post-trib, the one on the top. The one on the bottom that you're seeing says post-trib Prewrath. Same 7-year time period, but suddenly the day of the Lord disappears from the middle there. Instead, what you have there is just tribulation, Satan's wrath, things like that, occupying that middle part. Rapture takes place near the far end, but then you have day of the Lord shrunk down to about 1 full day, and then the day of the second coming is probably clustered in there somewhere at the end. It's a little confusing as to exactly what their sequence is, but significant to this particular view, I think Joel Richardson holds to something similar to this, is that they're not comfortable with putting the church in the heat of what they call the day of the Lord, particularly the bowl judgments. And so at that point in time, a rapture must take place prior to the bowl judgments, i.e. prior to the wrath of God, i.e. pre-wrath rapture, although wrapped in the bigger scheme known as post-trib, meaning it's after the tribulation, the 7-year tribulation, but prior to the day of the Lord, which is usually described as a single day. So that's kind of what's going on there. All right, let's go back to my notes here. And then I'm going to try and read down through them. Somewhat self-explanatory. I try to do that. I always fail, but hey, I'm trying. Got to give me credit for trying. All right, here are 5 random yet important reasons classic Prewrathers give for rejecting your average models of post-tribulationism. Read here as classic post-tribulationism, right? I'm making a qualifier because the hybrid version, the post-trib Prewrath, they themselves also are trying to lean closer into a Prewrath model like I already hold to. All right, so I give them kudos for that. But I supply some supporting scripture and were helpful citations of their interpretations. And so you're going to see some of the classic preterms. I think I quote Rosenthal, Kurschner, Charles Cooper. I think I also quote Professor Holtberg. He did that 3 positions book some time ago. I think I have a few quotes here from Aaron Eggman as well. Okay, so first point. Remember, there's only like 5 here. Post-trib confuses tribulation with God's wrath. These are in no particular order, but this is just one point that I brought up. They're just random. According to the Prewrathers, post-trib confuses tribulation with God's wrath. What do we mean? This critique of post-trib centers on a fundamental distinction that pre-wrath interpreters believe the Bible makes between 2 separate periods. Then those periods are the Great Tribulation, which is initiated by Satan and the Antichrist, e.g. Revelation 6, 9 through 11, as well as 13:7. And then the second period, which is the day of the Lord's wrath, which is God's direct judgment upon the ungodly, i.e. Revelation 6, 17, and 8, 1, and following. So, initially, there are 2 periods that we Prewrathers believe are separate from one another. Let me see if I've got this in any one of my slides. All right, take a look at this chart just for a moment. I'm not going to stay on this slide, but if I'm able to scroll down through it, that's why. The other one I can't scroll through and mark up at the same time. So in this version of, let me see, we're looking at the distinctions between the different sections. So for instance, let me pull out my markers. In the Prewrath Rapture, we've got 3 sections. We've got the beginning of sorrows over here. We've got the Great Tribulation here. Come on, mark like you like to. We got the Great Tribulation here. Okay, that's sloppy. Give me a second. There we go. Great Tribulation here. Then we've got the Day of the Lord, which is God's wrath over on the far end. Sorry, I can't draw very well today. The other 3 positions don't like to break up Daniel's 70th week the way that I've got them broken up in the Prewrath Rapture. So, for instance, if we go back and look at, some of the other positions, you can see that, let's see, it's done. Oops. You can see that in some of the other positions, God's wrath occupies the entire 70th week there. God's wrath occupies the same slot as the Great Tribulation, at least on this one as well, too. In one sense, God's wrath, if I look at it here, God's wrath is still occupying the same position as the Great Tribulation. Likewise, in this position here, God's wrath is here, and the Great Tribulation is here. They're both kind of overlapping. When we look at the Posttrib Rapture, same thing. God's wrath is here. Great Tribulation is here. And it's not until we get to the Prewrath Rapture that God's wrath is here, but that's different than the Great Tribulation there. So that's what I'm looking at. That's what I'm kind of focusing on right now, is that the critique that I have as a Prewrather against the Posttrib at this moment is that they confuse these 2 positions. All right, let's keep going in our critique. Classic post-tribulationism tends to treat the entire 70th week of Daniel, including all the seals, trumpets, and bowls, as divine wrath. They don't seem to give, and again, we're talking about classic, so we're talking about this one right here. They don't seem to give enough weight to doing what I believe the Bible is trying to teach us, and that's showing that there's a different time period. And we'll play this out later on as to why. So what they do is they simultaneously insist, so they lump all the seals, trumpets, and bowls together as divine wrath, but they simultaneously insist that the church remains on earth through it. So they use a principle known as kind of Goshen principle. You remember in the book of Exodus, when the plagues were being poured out on Egypt, God didn't remove, read here as rapture, Israel from Egypt and then pour out the plagues. Instead, he sheltered them in place. He put a protective bubble over them, like he put them under a supernatural umbrella, so that the weight of his retribution, his punishment against Egypt, his judgment against the gods of Egypt, his wrath wasn't experienced completely by the Israelites. Although, if you go back and read the story, actually, that umbrella concept didn't start until sometime into the plagues, but don't remind them about that. But either way, when we finally get to the most horrible of all the plagues, the death of the firstborn, Israel definitely spared. So, but that's not because they're under protective custody. It's because they put the blood of the Passover lamb on their doorposts. Post-tribbers, particularly those in Messianic circles who like to teach that the church and Israel are more joined than separate, they like to go back to the Exodus story and say that there's no need for a rapture to yank us out of harm's way. Instead, God has and will protect us supernaturally, seal us from his own wrath. And therefore, we can have our cake and eat it too. We can claim verses such as 1 Thessalonians 5:9 that I'm going to quote here in a moment, that God doesn't reserve us for wrath. We're not destined to wrath, and yet at the same time, he doesn't have to rapture us away to protect us. Prewrathers argue that this concept of allowing Christians to go through seals, trumpets, and bowls, and yet leaving us here to go through it, is a theological contradiction. What I mean is, if God's wrath is being poured out, then passages such as the one I just quoted, right, 1 Thessalonians 5:9, for God has not destined us to wrath, and also Revelation 3:10, which reads basically, I will also keep you from the hour of testing. These two verses must mean that the church is removed before his wrath begins, at least in the most natural sense of the word. When we're talking about wrath, they would mean that the church must be removed. In other words, it's consistent with a model that has a wrath of God in view. Now, I realize that the pre-tribbers come along and also conflate wrath with tribulation, and so for them, these verses take on an entirely new meaning. When it says, God has not destined us to wrath, and I'll also keep you from the hour of testing. Indeed, as I'm going to say here, specifically with regards to Revelation 3:10, classic Prewrathers view this verse as an exegetically strong proof text for a rapture before the eschatological wrath of God begins, but after the Great Tribulation, placing it in alignment with the sixth seal cosmic sign of Revelation 6:12 through 17, that signals the imminence of wrath. So, going back to our chart, what I mean by that is, if you look at the pre-wrath rapture here, we've got the Great Tribulation that is cut short by the pre-wrath rapture here, right? So it's this pre-wrath rapture. Well, let me put the arrow in a different place. It's actually the pre-wrath rapture right there. And so the pre-wrath rapture separates, it's that dividing line between the Great Tribulation and God's wrath. Let's continue. Thus, I say, germane to our primary point, Prewrath holds that post-trib improperly merges satanic persecution of the saints, which I call tribulation, specifically Great Tribulation, with God's eschatological punishment of the wicked, which we call wrath, leading to both exegetical and theological confusion. Right? I think the post-tribbers would do better if they followed the pre-wrath model and let Scripture define tribulation as that which is Satan's wrath against believers, compared with God's wrath as God's punishment against Satan and his evil followers, or people that follow after Satan, people who refused God's truth, things like that. All right, let's go to point number 2. Post-trib denies the imminent onset of wrath following the rapture. The imminent onset of wrath following the rapture. What do I mean? All right. What I say is that the rapture occurs just before the outpouring of divine wrath. All right. So when we go back over to this particular slide, we see that the rapture happens and then God's wrath is initiated. Could it be on the same day? There's scripture warrant to suggest that it does, right? Jesus gives us the example of Noah and of Lot in his Olivet Discourse sermon to the disciples there, its explanation. And in that description of the of his comparison between what's going to happen when he returns to what already took place in the days of Noah and then the days of Lot, language suggests that the very same day that the rescue of the righteous takes place, the judgment of wicked humanity is enacted. In Noah's day, Noah shut up in the ark, and the same day the door closed, the rains begin to pour down, and the judgment of the flood begins. Likewise with Lot, the same day that the angels rescued him from the city there, from Sodom and Gomorrah, is the same day that fire and brimstone rain down on them. There isn't this like 7-year gap or anything like that. So that's kind of what we're working from. So the rapture occurs just before the outpouring of divine wrath. However, in post-trib, there's no need to rescue the church, like in a rapture, since wrath supposedly occurs after Christ's coming. And you're like, what? Aren't rapture and second coming the same? Well, in the post-trib model, they're not quite the same. So when we go back over the post-trib rapture, we've got, remember, in their model, rapture and second coming are synonymous with one another, and in the even in the classic version, there's some amount of bowl activity, bowls, 7 bowls, activity that takes place just after the second coming. Which, again, it runs into scriptural problems that we're going to see here in a moment. But germane to my point here is that there's no need in the post-trib version for a significant rapture. It kind of neutralizes the rapture. Why go up and then come right back down if we're just going to do battle at with Antichrist at Armageddon and then be ushered into the kingdom? Why do we need to go up? But I get it. There's some scriptural support based on, from their perspective, they can't give up on that because there's this ancient Greek word, 2 Greek words actually, that talk about the people going out to meet the significant dignitary and then escort him back into the city. And they're like, this is what the rapture is playing. It's playing that part of going up to meet Yeshua and then escort him right back down to earth. So it's an immediate U-turn on their part. But it still stands that there's no need to rescue the church since wrath supposedly occurs after Christ's coming in their particular model. So we got two verses here. 1 Thessalonians 1:10, Jesus who rescues us from the wrath to come. And then we've got 1 Thessalonians 5:9, for God hath not destined us for wrath. And so look at my bullet points here. This is not a major point, so I'm not spending too much time on it. Prewrath emphasizes temporal separation between tribulation and wrath. Post-trib, by comparison, collapses this separation and often places the rapture inside the outpouring of wrath, e.g. the bowls of Revelation 16. So this is where the classic version just smashes all of the activities of the tribulation or God's wrath to the very end of the 7th week, and then just says there's going to be some second coming that primarily takes place near the end of the week, and the rapture isn't really needed, but only to the point that we have to kind of go out, meet Yeshua in the air, and then escort him back down to earth. But what's significantly is that the second coming is primarily in view in their position. So again, it's kind of a continuation of this idea where they don't separate tribulation of Satan from wrath of God. They have Christians going through the wrath, which that part is a major point of contention for me as a Prewrather. But this idea of, are we rescued in front of the bowls or rescued out on the other half of the bowls, that part we have to look at the book of Revelation to get more context. Actually, if you read through the book of Revelation at face value and take it in sequence order, then the trumpets are poured out starting in chapter 8, and the bowl judgments are poured out starting around chapter 9, I believe. But the story gets slightly interrupted. I think it's 9. But either way, by the time we get to Battle of Armageddon language in chapter 19 or 20 or so, we're already past the bowl judgments. So I don't know where pre-tribbers or post-tribbers get their position that their second coming is before a bowl judgment. That kind of doesn't work. And yet, are we going to go through the bowl judgments? Well, I don't know what they're doing with that. So some confusion in my opinion. I've got a quote down here from Marvin Rosenthal, one of the fathers of the pre-wrath position. He says, Posttribulationism violates the promise that the church is exempt from God's wrath. And that's from his book that I mentioned earlier, The Prewrath Rapture of the Church, which I have sitting on my shelf. All right, let's keep going. Point number 3 of only 5 points. So I might finish a lot of this tonight. I might not. Post-trib cannot explain the ingressive language of Revelation 6:17. All right, warning. This particular objection is a bit more technical and thus will require a longer than usual answer. All right, I'm trying not to make this a technical treatment of this particular issue, but for this particular answer, I'm going to get a little bit more technical. So let's take a look at the details of this particular answer without getting too technical, okay? First, we have Revelation 6:17, which I've quoted in 3 different versions. We've got just an NASB version of Revelation 6:17, which reads, "For the great day of their wrath has come, and who is able to stand?" All right, I'm breaking into context, I realize, but the point of the verse that we're going to look at is this Greek phrase that I've got highlighted in bold in all 3 versions, and it's translated in the NASB as "has come." So the subject is the wrath, right? The great day of the wrath of the Father and the Son, the great day of the Lamb and the one sitting on the throne and of the Lamb. That's what the context is talking about. And in the English, it says "has come." All right. If we look at the morphological Greek New Testament this time, instead of normally I would look at the SBLGNT, but they're basically the same thing. But the label I'm getting here is actually the morphological Greek New Testament. We have, it reads, "Hati eilthen he hemera he megale tes orges auton kai tis dunatai sta thenai." And the word in focus is the one that I've highlighted in underlined. Eilthen, has come, or something to that effect. And then just to make sure that I'm representing both kind of primary textual variants that your average reader deals with when they buy your Bible, such as a KJV versus a modern version like NASB or ESV or something like that, those 2 English translations represent 2 different kind of textual families. The KJV, on one hand, represents an older textual manuscript family of Textus Receptus, and sometimes there are variants, I shouldn't say variants there, but there are differences in the manuscript readings compared to the newer, the more recently discovered, that's what I mean by newer, but in reality, the age of the manuscripts is older, but the fact that we discovered them lately produced our later, more contemporary Bibles, such as NASB, ESV, NIV, things like that. And they go with the Alexandrinus text, which is my morphological Greek New Testament. All right, I produced both of them here just to show you that in this case, they are identical. Let me read the Greek from the Textus Receptus. It says, "Hati eilthen, he hemera he megale tes orges autu, kai tis dunatai sta thenai." And they are identical in every way except for a comma in one place after the autu. I mean, other than that, I'm glancing at them with my eyes. I'm looking at all the breath marks between the 2 megale tes orges autu, and then there's okay, I see another difference. Not huge difference. In the morphological Greek New Testament, this pronoun here, auton, so this line reads, "the wrath of them." The "them" in question, by the way, is, in context, is the wrath of the Lamb and of, or their, I should say, the wrath of their, them, is the wrath of the Lamb and he who sits on the throne that the earth dwellers see in the context of this passage. So the wrath or their wrath is how it's translated in the English up above, right? Like that. So that's the auton. But in the Textus Receptus, it uses a different form of the Greek. It says autu. So we would see how this showed up if we, in fact, I am going to pull it up. If I pull up the KJV version, which I'm going to do here for you. There we go. So, let me go to Bibles. So what we have is Revelation 6:17 in a few different versions. KJV says, "For the great day of his wrath is come, and who shall be able to stand?" So notice the variant, his wrath. But NESB 95, using a different text, says their wrath. So there is the Greek word auton, it's the plural. But the KJV, the Textus Receptus Greek autu, is a singular, his wrath. So that's the difference. ESV uses auton there. New King James, autu, his. New Living Translation, auton, there. NIV, there. NASB, like I read a moment ago, there. And so you can see. And now we can see here the two versions back to back again. We have auton here, which produces there as a plural. We have autu here, which produces his, which is a singular. All right, so that's a primary difference between those two. All right, let's keep going because, like I said, I'm not trying to get overly technical in this particular part of my commentary. Nearly every reputable dictionary defines ingressive, right? Earlier I said Posttrib cannot explain the ingressive language of Revelation 6:17. Most people are starting to ask at this point in time, what the heck does ingressive mean? Nearly every reputable dictionary defines ingressive as relating to ingress, having the quality or character of entering. So let's keep going. In Prewrath Eschatology, this verse with the aorist verb eilthen signals the arrival of wrath after the cosmic signs in the sixth seal. This verb is definitely aorist, but it is also believed by many scholars to be ingressive as well. For more on this particular form of Greek verb, see the excursus below. I've got an excursus in this commentary, but I am absolutely not going to actually look at the excursus right now. What I'm going to do is something unusual I've never really done before. I'm going to ask those of you who are watching this YouTube video to put a comment in the video below, in the comment section, and just say, you can just write one word, write excursus, EXCURSUS. And if you put that in there, then I will do a separate show on the excursus, and I'll upload it to the video channel. If I get enough of a response of viewers that say, read the excursus. Otherwise, when I look at the comments, if I don't get any feedback that says, that doesn't say anything about excursus, then I'm not going to read down through it. I'm just going to assume that you guys kind of following along. You don't need me to further explain this aorist Greek verb. So what I am saying, however, is that this verb eilthen, if I go back over to my tool here at Bible Hub, blueletterbible.com, and I go into the interlinear, I can start scrolling down and looking at the breakdown, and we can see the very second word, which is really kind of cool, this one right here, is our Greek word eilthen. And so the root word is erchomai, and it's Strong's number 2064. It's translated as has come in this tool, right? And if we look at here, we'll see the inflected form is eilthen, so the root word is erchomai. I'm working from this little box over on the right. Strong's number 2064. English has come. But this verb is a aorist active indicative. So there's no doubt that it's aorist. And that's where I said I could jump more into what aorist means, but I don't want to get too technical now. So if you want more on what the aorist means and how it plays out in this particular verse, and particularly how it's relevant to what I'm calling ingressive, then in the notes below, in the comments below the video, just type the word excursus, and I'll explain more. But if I don't get any more feedback on that, then I'll just keep going. All right.